James Buchanan was appointed Secretary of State by President James K. Polk on March 6, 1845. Buchanan entered duty on March 10, 1845, and left the position on March 7, 1849. After an unsuccessful bid for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1852, Buchanan secured the nomination in 1856 and was elected president. He served one term, from 1857 to 1861. James Buchanan, Jr. was an American lawyer, diplomat, and politician. He served as the 15th President of the United States from 1857 to 1861, as the Secretary of State from 1845 to 1849, and represented Pennsylvania in both houses of the U.S. Congress. He was an advocate for states' rights, particularly regarding slavery, and minimized the role of the federal government preceding the Civil War. Buchanan was a prominent lawyer in Pennsylvania and won his first election to the state's House of Representatives as a Federalist. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1820 and retained that post for 5 terms, aligning with Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. Buchanan served as Jackson's minister to Russia in 1832. He won the election in 1834 as a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania and continued in that position for 11 years. He was appointed to serve as President James K. Polk's Secretary of State in 1845, and 8 years later was named as President Franklin Pierce's minister to the United Kingdom. Beginning in 1844, Buchanan became a regular contender for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. He was finally nominated and won the 1856 presidential election. As president, Buchanan intervened to assure the Supreme Court's majority ruling in the pro-slavery decision in the Dred Scott case. He acceded to Southern attempts to engineer Kansas' entry into the Union as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution, and angered not only Republicans but also Northern Democrats. Buchanan honored his pledge to serve only one term and supported Breckinridge's unsuccessful candidacy in the 1860 presidential election. He failed to reconcile the fractured Democratic Party amid the grudge against Stephen Douglas, leading to the election of Republican and former Congressman Abraham Lincoln. Buchanan's leadership during his lame duck period, before the American Civil War, has been widely criticized. He simultaneously angered the North by not stopping secession and the South by not yielding to their demands. He supported the ineffective Corwin Amendment in an effort to reconcile the country. He made an unsuccessful attempt to reinforce Fort Sumter, but otherwise refrained from preparing the military. In his personal life, Buchanan never married and was the only U.S. president to remain a lifelong bachelor, leading some historians and authors to question his sexual orientation. His failure to forestall the Civil War has been described as incompetence, and he spent his last years defending his reputation. Historians and scholars rank Buchanan as among the worst presidents in American history. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, 1857 to 1861, served immediately prior to the American Civil War. He remains the only president to be elected from Pennsylvania and to remain a lifelong bachelor. Tall, stately, stiffly formal in the high stock he wore around his jowls, James Buchanan was the only president who never married. Presiding over a rapidly dividing nation, Buchanan grasped inadequately the political realities of the time. Relying on constitutional doctrines to close the widening rift over slavery, he failed to understand that the North would not accept constitutional arguments which favored the South. Nor could he realize how sectionalism had realigned political parties. The Democrats split, the Whigs were destroyed, giving rise to the Republicans. Born into a well-to-do Pennsylvania family in 1791, Buchanan, a graduate of Dickinson College, was gifted as a debater and learned in the law. He was elected 5 times to the House of Representatives, then, after an interlude as minister to Russia, served for a decade in the Senate. He became Polk's Secretary of State and Pierce's minister to Great Britain. Service abroad helped to bring him the Democratic nomination in 1856 because it had exempted him from involvement in bitter domestic controversies. As president-elect, Buchanan thought the crisis would disappear if he maintained a sectional balance in his appointments and could persuade the people to accept constitutional law as the Supreme Court interpreted it. The court was considering the legality of restricting slavery in the territories, and two justices hinted to Buchanan what the decision would be. Thus, in his inaugural the president referred to the territorial question as happily, a matter of but little practical importance since the Supreme Court was about to settle it speedily and finally. 2 days later Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered the Dred Scott decision, asserting that Congress had no constitutional power to deprive persons of their property rights in slaves in the territories. Southerners were delighted, but the decision created a furor in the North. Buchanan decided to end the troubles in Kansas by urging the admission of the territory as a slave state. Although he directed his presidential authority to this goal, he further angered the Republicans and alienated members of his own party. Kansas remained a territory. When Republicans won a plurality in the House in 1858, every significant bill they passed fell before Southern votes in the Senate or a presidential veto. The federal government reached a stalemate. Sectional strife rose to such a pitch in 1860 that the Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern wings, each nominating its own candidate for the presidency. Consequently, when the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, it was a foregone conclusion that he would be elected even though his name appeared on no Southern ballot. Rather than accept a Republican administration, the Southern fire-eaters advocated secession. President Buchanan, dismayed and hesitant, denied the legal right of states to secede but held that the federal government legally could not prevent them. He hoped for compromise, but secessionist leaders did not want compromise. Then Buchanan took a more militant tack. As several cabinet members resigned, he appointed Northerners, and sent the Star of the West to carry reinforcements to Fort Sumter. On January 9, 1861, the vessel was far away. Buchanan reverted to a policy of inactivity that continued until he left office. In March 1861 he retired to his Pennsylvania home Wheatland, where he died 7 years later, leaving his successor to resolve the frightful issue facing the nation. Historians often label James Buchanan as one of the worst presidents in United States history. His presidency was marked with conflict, a conflict that had been brewing for over 30 years. Yet, Buchanan's actions, and at times his inactions, aggravated sectional tensions to the point where the Union dissolved. James Old Buck Buchanan was born to wealthy Irish immigrants on April 23, 1791, in rural Cove Gap, Pennsylvania. He entered Dickinson College at the age of 16, 2 years later he graduated with honors. After his graduation in 1809, Buchanan studied law, and as his legal career grew so did his political one. Buchanan served in a reserve unit during the War of 1812 and did not experience any combat, and shortly after the war, the Old Buck served in the Pennsylvania state legislature before his election to serve in the United States House of Representatives from 1821 until 1831, where he sat on the House Judiciary Committee. Initially a Federalist, Buchanan left that party as it began to crumble and attached himself to the political movement of the rising star in the Democratic-Republican Party, Andrew Jackson. When the Democratic-Republican Party morphed into the Democratic Party under Jacksonian values in 1825, Buchanan became a leader of the party in Pennsylvania. Although Jackson turned on Buchanan when he believed the young congressman participated in the corrupt bargain that cost Old Hickory the election, Buchanan remained loyal to Jackson and helped him win the state of Pennsylvania in the 1828 and 1832 elections. Jackson rewarded Buchanan's loyalty by appointing him as minister to Russia in 1832. When Buchanan returned from Russia in 1833, he ran for the Senate and won. While in the Senate, the Pennsylvanian served on and eventually chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. From 1845 until 1849, Buchanan served as Secretary of State under President James Polk and worked toward a compromise between Polk and England over Oregon's northern boundary. Following President Zachary Taylor's election in 1848, Buchanan returned home to Pennsylvania with presidential ambition in his eyes. The old buck and Senator Stephen Douglas, also known as Little Giant, bitterly fought for the Democratic nomination in 1852 until the little-known New Hampshire politician Franklin Pierce came on the scene and secured the nomination. After this showdown, Buchanan despised Douglas, as he perceived Douglas's candidacy denied Buchanan the presidency. Their relationship never recovered. President Peace appointed Buchanan to the position of Minister to England, which turned out to be a blessing for Buchanan's presidential ambitions as it kept him active in politics, but distant from the turmoil in the Pierce administration, specifically the fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act. When Buchanan's plan to purchase or conquer Cuba in order to expand plantation land and slavery came to light in 1854 with the Ostend Manifesto, he enraged anti-slavery forces but garnered support among Southerners who viewed the Pennsylvanian as a politician who sought to expand and protect slavery. This support proved to be vital to his presidential campaign. Buchanan's absence during the Kansas-Nebraska Act debacle enabled his nomination for president in 1856. Party leaders viewed Buchanan as a compromise between the splintering northern and southern wings of the party, as Buchanan was a northern man with southern principles. Running against Buchanan was the politically incompetent John C. Fremont, nominated by the burgeoning Republican Party, and former President Millard Fillmore of the practically dead Know-Nothing Party. In this three-way electoral contest, Buchanan was the only true national candidate, as both Fremont and Fillmore catered to sectional interests. Southerners threatened to secede if Fremont was elected, which foreshadowed their reaction to Abraham Lincoln's candidacy only 4 years later. This threat of secession aided Buchanan, as Northerners were more inclined to vote for a candidate that would prevent disunion. Although Buchanan won the election, he lost to Fremont in the North, carrying only 5 states. In contrast, Buchanan won every Southern state except Maryland. In doing so, the Pennsylvanian was the first president since Andrew Jackson in 1828 to win the presidency without carrying a majority of free states along with the slave states. This marked the ever-growing sectional imbalance in the Democratic Party. Buchanan's presidency was marred with conflict. However, one of the most significant events of his presidency began to unfold even before his inauguration. At the heart of the Dred Scott v. Stanford case was the status of slavery in the territories, an issue that had plagued American politics since the Missouri Compromise. Buchanan desperately hoped that the Supreme Court would unequivocally settle this massive issue before his inauguration in March of 1857. In violation of presidential ethics, on February 3, 1857, the president-elect began corresponding with Justice John Catron of Tennessee. Buchanan inquired as to when the country would learn about a decision and if the decision would be narrowly focused or broad. In his response, Catron did not answer as to when a decision would be handed down, but did mention that the territorial question would be involved. On February 23, 1857, Justice Robert Grier of Pennsylvania responded to an earlier letter of Buchanan and tipped him off to the coming decision, writing 6 if not 7 will declare that the Compromise Law of 1820 to be non-effect. With this prior knowledge in his inaugural address, Buchanan referred to Dred Scott as a decision that would speedily and finally resolve all questions about slavery in the territories, and he would cheerfully submit to that decision. On March 6, 1857, 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, Chief Justice Roger Taney released the court's decision. In this decision, the court ruled that black Americans, free and enslaved, lacked citizenship rights and thus lacked the ability to sue for their freedom. Most significantly, the court ruled that neither Congress nor a territorial government could restrict slavery in the territories, as doing so violated the Fifth Amendment. Although Buchanan certainly overstepped by corresponding with these justices and encouraging them to release a broad decision instead of a narrow one, his critics imagined something much worse. In their minds, the slave power controlled every aspect of this case, from the president and justices to Dred Scott's lawyers. All were members of the slave power and conspired to deliver a radical pro-slavery decision. It was not the fringe members of society who propagated this fanatic conspiracy. William Seward of New York, the most famous Republican politician at the time, accused Buchanan and the Supreme Court of conspiracy, tyranny, deception, and subversion. Lincoln also propagated this theory, although he toned down his rhetoric, often using humor to reproach Buchanan. There is no explicit evidence that the Dred Scott decision was a large plot orchestrated by the slave power. The very fact that Buchanan inappropriately corresponded with the justices highlights his lack of knowledge prior to Justice Greer heavily alluding to the decision. In reality, it was a last-minute decision to deliver such a broad verdict. However, Buchanan continued to face charges of being a dough-faced Democrat, and the controversy surrounding the decision and his role in it plagued his administration. However, Buchanan's role in the Lecompton crisis proved to be detrimental to his presidency. As soon as Buchanan took office, he resolved to rapidly admit Kansas into the Union, either as a slave state or a free state. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that Buchanan would not settle for anything except Kansas's admission under the Lecompton Constitution, a pro-slavery constitution that violated popular sovereignty. The old buck had strong personal and professional relationships with many of his Southern colleagues, relationships that would be destroyed if he came out against the Lecompton Constitution. Additionally, Buchanan faced political ruin if he denounced the Constitution as a violation of popular sovereignty, as Southerners were his main political base. 112 out of 174 of his electoral college votes came from the South. Consequently, Buchanan firmly supported the Lecompton Constitution and staked his reputation on its passage through Congress. Putting a foil in Buchanan's plan was his old rival Senator Douglas, who publicly opposed this bill and worked with Republicans to stop its passage. With memories of his failed bid for the 1,852 nomination still on Buchanan's mind, he was always frosty to the senator because the experienced statesman often felt threatened by the younger Douglas, who was a gifted orator and by all accounts a better politician. Douglas's opposition turned out to be fatal, as he mobilized enough Northern Democrats in the House to block the passage of the bill. These Northern Democrats offered to end the stalemate and vote for the Constitution, slave clause and all, if Kansans could amend their Constitution at any time and not wait the 7 years currently stipulated. In one of the most puzzling and self-destructive decisions of his presidency, Buchanan rejected this offer. Eventually, the Lecompton Constitution failed for good, and it remained a territory until 1861. Buchanan's unwavering support for the Lecompton Constitution stressed the already fractured relationship between the northern and southern wings of the party. Unlike with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when peace took similar enormous risks for it to pass, Buchanan's political risks never paid off. In the 1858 midterms, Northern Democrats faced a bitter fight, with almost 50% of Northern Democratic seats being turned over to Republican ones, and Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives. Of the Northern congressmen that kept their seats, the majority opposed the Lecompton Constitution. Buchanan's actions during this crisis made it increasingly clear that the Democratic Party, as a national party, would cease to exist if the president continued to subjugate Northern interests to Southern ones. Additionally, Douglas's re-election combined with the failure of the Lecompton bill illustrates that Buchanan had almost no control over his party and lacked true political power. By the end of 1858, Douglas was the most powerful man in the Democratic Party. In mid-October 1859, abolitionist fanatic and murderer John Brown raided the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to initiate a slave rebellion that would lead to the abolition of all slaves. Sectional tensions exploded after this event, with Northerners viewing Brown as a martyr and Southerners terrified that their greatest fear came true: servile insurrection led by secret abolitionists masquerading in Southern society. In another huge misstep in his presidency, Buchanan did nothing to alleviate these sectional tensions, thereby allowing them to fester. While his inaction with John Brown's raid aggravated sectional tensions, his inaction during the secession winter proved to be fatal both to his reputation and, more importantly, to the Union. Buchanan did not seek the presidential nomination in 1860, as he vowed before his inauguration to only serve one term. Abraham Lincoln's victory triggered the secession of the lower South states, with South Carolina issuing their Ordinance of Secession on December 20, 1860. During this period, Buchanan tried to remain conciliatory, neither wanting to alienate Unionists nor secessionists, but in doing so pleased no one. Buchanan refused to take any action against the South which enabled the creation and operation of the Confederate government, which possibly could have been prevented with decisive action. Buchanan's inaction simply prolonged the aversion of the war. His official response to the crisis came in his annual message to Congress on December 6, 1860. Buchanan recommended a new constitutional convention to solve the crisis, which never came into fruition. Buchanan's anticlimactic annual message reinforced the perception that the Buchanan White House was weak, and that the president simply wanted to avoid war until he left office. After Lincoln's inauguration, Buchanan retired to Pennsylvania to live a relatively quiet life. In response to vicious attacks on his presidency, Buchanan wrote his memoirs, in which he attempted to defend his name. These memoirs were published in 1866, a year after the Civil War ended. After the publication, Buchanan became a recluse, rarely leaving his home, which he died in on June 1, 1868, of respiratory failure. Before the Civil War was even over, contemporaries blamed Buchanan for the war, a pattern that continues to this day. And while the old buck certainly is responsible for the events that unfolded during his presidency, he is not the only character responsible for the events. This crisis had been brewing for over 30 years and grew each time a politician chose their party or a specific policy over union. Most historians agree that in the 1850s the war could have been averted, but politicians, Buchanan included, made disastrous decisions which only aggravated the crisis and pushed the country closer and closer to war. Though Buchanan predicted that history will vindicate my memory, historians have criticized Buchanan for his unwillingness or inability to act in the face of secession. Historical rankings of presidents of the United States without exception place Buchanan among the least successful presidents. When scholars are surveyed, he ranks at or near the bottom in terms of vision/agenda setting, domestic leadership, foreign policy leadership, moral authority, and positive historical significance of their legacy. According to surveys taken by American scholars and political scientists between 1948 and 1982, Buchanan ranks every time among the worst presidents of the United States, alongside Grant, Harding, Fillmore, and Nixon. A bronze and granite memorial near the southeast corner of Washington, D.C.'s Meridian Hill Park, was designed by architect William Gordon Beecher and sculpted by Maryland artist Hans Schuler. It was commissioned in 1916 but not approved by the U.S. Congress until 1918, and not completed and unveiled until June 26, 1930. The memorial features a statue of Buchanan, bookended by male and female classical figures representing law and diplomacy, with engraved text reading, "The incorruptible statesman whose walk was upon the mountain ranges of the law," a quote from a member of Buchanan's cabinet, Jeremiah S. Black. An earlier monument was constructed in 1907 to 1908 and dedicated in 1911, on the site of Buchanan's birthplace in Stony Batter, Pennsylvania. Part of the original 18.5-acre, 75,000 square meters, memorial site is a 250-ton pyramid structure that stands on the site of the original cabin where Buchanan was born. The monument was designed to show the original weathered surface of the native rubble and mortar. 3 counties are named in his honor, in Iowa, Missouri, and Virginia. Another in Texas was christened in 1858 but renamed Stevens County, after the newly elected Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, in 1861. The city of Buchanan, Michigan, was also named after him. Several other communities are named after him: the unincorporated community of Buchanan, Indiana, the city of Buchanan, Georgia, the town of Buchanan, Wisconsin, and the townships of Buchanan Township, Michigan, and Buchanan, Missouri. James Buchanan High School is a small, rural high school located on the outskirts of his childhood hometown, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. Thank you for watching this video.